Thanks for the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land, and I myself would like to pay my respects and the panel's respects to our elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. And here we are representing any Indigenous nations all around the world, because we have a number of people watching and also people on the panel from all around the world. So hopefully most of you who are joining to watch this panel might have already watched the movie, but for those of you who haven't, this is to accompany a really great movie called Meet the Future, which is a timely documentary about cell-based meat, also referred to as cultivated meat, a food science that grows real meat from animal cells in a controlled and clean environment. And this is a revolution in food production, proposing a sustainable way to feed the world in the future without the need to breed, raise and slaughter animals. So at the forefront is Dr. Uma Poletti from Memphis Meats. So our panel today will just talk through some of the aspects that were raised in the film. So firstly, I will introduce myself and then ask the panel members to introduce themselves. I am Professor Robin Warner from the University of Melbourne, and I've studied meat science, so I'm very interested in understanding the flavour and texture attributes of food and also of meat. There's a lot of underpinning science that is needed in that. I'm also the chair of the Future Food Hallmark Research Institute, and I'm moderating this session today. So now I'll hand over to the first person on my screen, to Bianca. I'd ask you to introduce yourself, Bianca.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. My name is Dr. Bianca and I'm a cell biologist and Director of Cellular Agriculture Australia. We are a non-profit organisation dedicated to promoting and accelerating the very exciting research of cellular agriculture here in Australia.
And sorry, now over to David Kay to introduce.
Sure, yeah, my name is David Kay. I'm the Senior Manager of Communications and Operations at Memphis Meats. So Memphis Meats is featured heavily in the film Meet the Future, which I highly encourage everybody to watch if they haven't already. Memphis Meats is a startup based in Berkeley, California, over in the US. And we are developing a way to grow real meat from animal cells for meat, poultry, and seafood. And so we were founded in 2015. And since that time, which was also the founding of the industry, we've really been working hard to bring these products to consumers. Most recently, we announced the construction of our pilot plant, which we just started construction on recently. And are working on that as a next step towards scaling up our production and ultimately bringing our products to consumers.
Thanks for that, David. And now Thomas King. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, Robin. My name is Thomas King. I'm the CEO of Food Frontier. We are Australia and New Zealand's think tank and expert advisor on alternative proteins. We look at both plant proteins and cellular agriculture, and we have a number of initiatives to support businesses and innovators and policymakers to navigate and understand the emergence of these technologies and how they can participate.
Thank you, Thomas. And finally, and most importantly, Liz Marshall from Canada. Thanks, Liz.
Hi, I'm Liz Marshall. I am the writer, director, and producer of Meet the Future, which is a 2020 release documentary that my team and I spent 3.5 years making. So we first started filming at Memphis Meats in 2016, and we're releasing the film in this COVID world that we're all navigating through, which I think actually is makes the film all the more timely and topical. And I'd like to thank the Environmental Film Festival of Australia for screening the film at its 10th annual festival. It's really exciting, and it's great to be here on this panel with all of my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Liz. And just to remind us that the festival is about taking a closer look at the interactions between science, technology, philosophy, and art, and thinking about what is strangely familiar, and familiarly strange. So I think this is part of our conversation as well, because we are in a new world. So I'm just going to go forward and ask some questions of each panelist, and then we'll have a general discussion as well. So David, I'd like to start with you. Firstly, what an amazing journey through the years for your company. Exciting times. In the movie, the product is called Clean Meat, but I see at the end on the back of the box for the beef meatballs that Uma Valenti holds that the description refers to made from cell-based meat. And I'm aware that the Good Food Institute in the USA uses the term cultivated meat. Can you talk us through the nomenclature and these changes that have happened recently, and maybe also about a little bit about the cultivated meat industry at present in the USA?
Sure, yeah, happy to. So starting on the question of nomenclature, we announced in 2018 that we would start using the term cell-based meat. Prior to that, we had been using clean meat, as you suggested, Robin. And the reason was we got some feedback that the term clean meat could be seen as disparaging to conventionally produced meat products and imply that they were dirty or something to that effect. That was not our intention when we set out and started using the term clean meat, but we took that feedback to heart. And when we were trying to come up with a new form of nomenclature, we had a few goals. One, we wanted the term to be inclusive. So we didn't want it to be perceived as disparaging another industry or any other stakeholder in the space. But we also wanted to make sure it was descriptive and, of course, factual and accurate. We wanted to make sure that when consumers heard it, it gave them a sense of what the product was. And so that was really high on our priority list. And so we actually came out with the North American Meat Institute, which is the largest trade association representing the conventional meat industry, as I said, in 2018. And we co-signed a letter together, and that letter talked about a few things, but one of those was nomenclature. Since that time, the cell-based meat industry in the US has formally adopted two terms to refer to the products. Cell-based and cultured is the other term. And so those are the two that we've used. Those are the ones that the North American Meat Institute continues to use, as well as a lot of the kind of third-party observers, journalists, and other stakeholders like that. That's kind of how we got here. To your other question, Robin, about kind of an overview of the US industry, there's dozens of companies now based in the US, and I should say over 50 globally by my count. In the US, a lot of them are focused in the Bay Area, geographically in California. So this is San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, and we are one of those. And I think we've seen a proliferation of companies, as I said, in the US, but also all around the world, including in Australia, which has been a really promising sign. We've seen governments around the world express interest in cell-based meat. And we can talk more about specifically what that has looked like in the US, or others on the panel can probably speak to what that has looked like in Australia. But happy to go into those details later in the panel.
Thanks, David. And moving on to, I'm going to ask Thomas King a question, whether there's anything you'd like to add from a consumers and messaging terminology from an Australian perspective, and also maybe on the cultivated meat progress and developments in Australia. Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the communication around this space and the technology, the terminology that we use as part of that is crucial. Even at this early stage of development of the industry, we know that there's more public discussion and media coverage about this space. And that means that consumers are watching and listening. And so, people have an emotional association with food. When we're talking about a product that people are putting into their bodies, most people's decisions won't necessarily be led by logic. They'll be driven by emotion, fears and desires. And so it's really about whether it feels right to people. And the answer to that question in the context of cell-based products will differ considerably depending on how that question's asked and the context it's given. We know from consumer research around the world that how cell-cultivated meat and its production process is described influences consumers' perceptions and receptiveness to a considerable degree. And so the general trend is the more information that consumers are given about the product, about the process, about the potential benefits, the more interested and open they are to trying it, which makes sense because we're naturally resistant to change and cautious or even fearful of what we don't understand, particularly when it comes to something like food. And so, you know, there are obviously parallels there and lessons to be learned from something like the genetic modification journey, because regardless of how you might feel about GM food, there's not robust evidence to suggest that it has negative impacts on the human body. And yet there's so much fear stemming from misinformation and misunderstanding that's led to many populations and countries just rejecting GM entirely. And so it's great to see alliances in cellular agriculture being established, like in the US, the Alliance for Meat, Poultry and Seafood Innovation. And at Food Frontier, we're pleased to be helping play a similar function in this market to bring together players to work collaboratively on those sorts of industry-wide issues and opportunities, whether it's with reference to regulation all the way through to public messaging. And so in terms of the commercial ecosystem in Australia, it's grown considerably. It's still very small though. When Food Frontier began about 3.5 years ago, there were, I think, 1 or 2 companies from memory, and they were still in the very, very early stages. Now we have 6 different companies with a range of different focus areas. So a couple are focused on the finished product. Some are specializing in media, in the nutrient feed needed for the cells, some on scaffolding, and they're spread across the country. So some in Sydney, Brisbane, WA. And so there's a lot of potential for Australia to lead our region based on the intellectual capital we have, the infrastructure, the reputation. You know, we have some of the best capabilities in this whole region of the world in the exact fields of science and engineering needed to advance cellular agriculture. And so, you know, for us to compete internationally, we should be leveraging that and investing in that. And that also requires government support. Otherwise, we risk losing our startups who may well go offshore.
Which comes up in the movie, of course. Thanks, Thomas. Liz, I'd like to move on to a question with you. And by the way, congratulations on your movie. Most insightful and interesting. Can you tell us a little about the experience of making the movie and maybe any insights you gained or shifts in your thinking? How can documentary filmmaking and communicating the science behind cultured meat help raise our public interest and maybe even hopefully change consumer taste and attitude?
Well, first of all, the Meet the Future is about, it introduces the world to this big, huge concept, this big, huge idea that is still largely maybe misunderstood or not fully grasped. You know, it is hard to, you know, get your head around it at first when you start learning about it. So documentary offers a unique platform in the world to communicate and to usher really important, significant, and innovative, revolutionary concepts, stories, and people into people's living rooms. And, you know, we're dealing with a global pandemic right now. And so a lot of people are watching from their screens at home. I mean, it's been really unfortunate to not be in theaters, having that live, visceral, interactive experience with audiences that I'm so used to. But at the same time, there is still that huge, enormous opportunity to reach people through this medium, through this powerful platform of documentary filmmaking. And so Meet the Future is a character-driven film that follows, you know, the co-founder, the CEO of Memphis Meats, and his name is Dr. Uma Valeti. And through that entry point, that very humanizing and personal entry point, we can unpack this big idea, this big concept, by understanding what motivates the people behind it that are driving it forward. Also, because this film is very process driven, we had the privilege of exclusive behind the scenes access over a long period of time. So starting in 2016, and then we did our final shoot in the fall of 2019. That allowed us a tremendous trajectory to be a witness and to be a fly on the wall at times, and to really chronicle the birth of an industry at ground zero or during the genesis phase. And so in a way, Meet the Future is a historical document because the story continues, but it will enter a new stage and phase of its story. For example, because it's not yet regulated and available to consumers yet, but it will be soon, that will, you know, lend itself to being a brand new stage and phase of storytelling. Whereas what we've captured and what we've chronicled and packaged and, you know, it's being provided to the world in the form of a linear documentary is a story that stands the test of time. Because this is really, you know, when you start understanding what this idea is, and how it could change how food gets to the plate, how protein, which everyone needs to thrive and survive, you know, a whole new way, a whole new revolutionary way of getting meat to the plate. It changes our thinking. It changes the conversation. It changes the marketplace, and it changes and the social underpinnings is what I'm drawn to especially. So from an environmental perspective, from an animal perspective, from a human health perspective, there are just there's such a convergence here of social issues and also because it's about innovation, about pioneers, it's exciting. And it's solution focused. So when I really committed myself back in 2016 to making this film, two things I'd like to just say about that. One is that there's no certainty. So at that particular time and moving forward and trying to pitch it and get it off the ground and have the film industry support it, et cetera, there was no way of, you know, we didn't know the outcome. We didn't know whether Memphis Meats could sort of dissolve and whether this big idea, you know, maybe it was too soon for the world. But in fact, that's not what happened at all. The opposite happened. So we witnessed incredible acceleration, incredible momentum. And it was exciting and it was surprising. And the other thing I'd like to say is that, you know, there's this tremendous uncertainty as a filmmaker, but imagine what it's like for the startups. Imagine what it's like for Memphis Meats. And Uma Valetti took a very passion-driven, risky career turn. He had been a Mayo-trained cardiologist and a successful cardiologist, and he left cardiology to co-found Memphis Meats in 2015 without having any sense of certainty about the future around this big, risky, new idea. So it's very much about innovation. It's a film about pioneers, and it's a film about an idea whose time has come. And perhaps it's the biggest idea of the century in some ways.
Yes, thanks for that, Liz, and I agree with you. There's great moments in the movie as well, and we really saw Dr. Uma Valetti's journey. I just wanted to very much thank you for that. Just wanted to move forward to where I see there was a most interesting moment in the movie during the hearing. And the hearing was about how cultivated meat might be regulated when someone says, I think it's to the USDA guy, do you want USA to be the first to develop this. And this is really around, what's going to happen with regulation. And correct me if I'm wrong with who said it, but this person emphatically says yes. And I thought that was a really important point in the movie. It was interesting. David, can you talk us through what that pivotal moment is for regulation? And then I might ask Thomas to talk about how that might, the regulatory aspects in Australia. Thanks, David.
Sure, yeah, and I agree. I think it is such a dramatic moment in the film. I think this speaks to the broader approach and really the philosophy that both of the relevant regulatory agencies in the U.S. Have taken from the beginning. And so I should back up and just say that cell-based meat in the U.S. will be jointly regulated by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA. And we can talk more about how they're going to divvy up that jurisdiction and the details of that if that's of interest. But I think one of the things we have been really happy about and grateful for has been the speed and the openness that both of the agencies have demonstrated to this point in clarifying the regulatory path to market. And I think, that speaks to a few things. One, I think it speaks to a recognition that food innovation is a really important part of the food system. And I think both the agencies want to be supportive of innovation. I think it also speaks to the fact that they understand the need to establish a level playing field, to have a system that is, provides a transparency that consumers will expect. But also, and this gets more to the specific comment in the film, I think they want the US to maintain its leadership position in the world for issues related to food and agriculture. And I think that, they recognize that in order for that to happen, there needs to be a fully clarified regulatory path to market, on a reasonable time frame. And so that's something that we've found them to be really willing partners in working with the industry, but also all the other stakeholders involved in the food and agriculture space in the US. The coalition that Thomas mentioned earlier, the Alliance for Meat, Poultry, and Seafood Innovation, you can think of it as kind of a precursor to a trade association for US-based cell-based meat companies. And earlier this year, we actually published an op-ed which kind of made that point that if the US wants to maintain and continue to be a leader in food and agriculture as it historically has, that will require a continued effort to really drive forward on clarifying the regulatory path to market. And I think that moment in the film, as dramatic as it is, really encapsulates the agency's attitude with respect to this issue.
Thanks for that. And that was I should have said spoiler alert. I'm sorry for that one. But also the fact, I won't name the companies, but two meat companies, very, very big meat companies who I'm familiar with in the USA are investing. And we also have meat companies in Australia who are interested in investing. And Thomas, maybe I'll hand over to you to maybe give the Australian perspective on the regulation side.
Sure. So for those listening that mightn't understand how food regulation in Australia works, we have a body called FSANZ, Food Standards Australia New Zealand, that develops the technical standards for food regulation. And those standards are then approved by the Ministerial Forum on Food Regulation. And so there's representatives from each of the Australian states as well as and territories, as well as New Zealand on that forum, as part of that forum. And so with reference to cell-based products, FSANZ believes that the existing standards are adequate to cover the emergence of meat products cultivated from cells, and they've produced some information about that. Depending on the composition of the product, those standards could include things like the novel food standards, processing aid standards, food additive standards, labeling standards, etc. And so it's worth noting that FSANZ cooperates closely with and pays very close attention to regulatory developments overseas. And so the implementation of a regulatory regime overseas could foreseeably influence the development of an Australian approach, Australia-New Zealand approach, because it's the same regime for both countries. And so we've at Food Frontier, we've engaged with FSANZ for a number of years to try and sort of gain some clarity and put this on their radar and understand what a regulatory pathway could look like for cell-based products in our jurisdiction. And essentially, an initial commercial application needs to be made to really gain clarity on that. And so we've been engaging with, again, the companies within the space, and we're confident that the first commercial application's not far off. But within our region, we've seen other markets like Singapore, for example, express a desire to fast track the establishment of their regulatory framework. And so again, coming back to that international competitiveness piece, and to reference another quote from the US Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, in the US, he told the Wall Street Journal back in November 2018 that he doesn't want this technology to feel like they've got to go offshore or outside the US to get a fair regulatory protocol. And I think we need to be making the same consideration here in Australia, because the question isn't whether this will happen. It's pretty clear that this technology is very, very promising, and that cellular agriculture is likely to form a significant part of the future food supply. So the question for Australia is, to what extent do we want to participate? To what extent does Australia want to harness our strengths and positioning to pioneer in this field and lead our region?
Thanks, Thomas. And I'm going to move forward to another topic now. And I know we have another film being shown in the festival, which is more about going back to nature and back to the land. So there's this, what I see is this sort of, in a way, different ends of the pendulum with these sorts of foods. So this is maybe ask Liz and Bianca to comment here. There is a perception that cultured meat or cultivated meat might be viewed as ultra processed. So if you have to add more ingredients to bring in good taste and texture. And this in a way is the extreme to the slow food movement, which we've certainly had a rise in Australia. So what are your thoughts about this cultured meat or cell-based meat and science-based food innovation in relation to the current trend of going back to nature and also back to the land?
I actually don't think that they're on opposite sides of the spectrum, cellular agriculture and this idea of going back to the land. I think cellular agriculture is one of the solutions to, rewilding the land and ensuring that this, mass extinction that Earth is currently undergoing, or this loss in biodiversity, it can definitely be mitigated with this new technology. So yeah, I think there's definitely room for cellular agriculture and this new trend towards, looking after our planet and ensuring that we're not depleting our scarce resources.
And Liz, did you want to comment as well? Thanks, Bianca.
Yes, there's a lot of discussion around, and there's documentaries around regenerative agriculture right now. And from a perspective of mass production, feeding the world with a growing population and with, rising economies that have also higher meat consumption. We are actually laser focused on the film on what the problem is with industrial scaled conventional animal agriculture, whereas local regenerative methods is a niche practice that is not going away. And frankly, that's not the issue. So from a solution focus, we're looking at, very dramatic, epic scale issues here pertaining to biodiversity, pertaining to greenhouse gas emissions, pertaining to water and land use, water contamination. Roughly 45% of the world's land surface area is used for animal agriculture. And, we could go on and with statistics, but this cellular agriculture is providing, offering a solution-focused way forward when it comes to the issue of scaling up and providing a different vehicle to produce meat. That's what this is about. And so I think when that can be understood, when people can understand where the vast majority of the meat that they're eating, where it actually comes from, it comes from the industrial conventional system, then I think then when there's greater education around that piece, I think there will be more of an openness to understanding the anticipated benefits of this new industry.
Thanks, Liz. That's very insightful. I'd like to move forward now because we've started to talk about maybe sustainability and environment. And I think there's a few drivers for cultivated meat or cell-based meat. And certainly one of those drivers is sustainability and the environment. So I'm just going to put a few things into the conversation, and then I thought we might all talk about them. And one of the things, Liz, that you raised, this aspect, which was very obvious in the film, is the industrial scale conventional animal agriculture, which I think is to some extent certainly quite different in Australia compared to the USA. And sometimes people certainly provide data around, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, comparing using USA data, North America data, and we certainly have some data in Australia on that. So that's one conversation. And I think the other thing is that in terms of the environment and sustainability is that there's obviously, we need to be doing a number of things, as we all know. Food waste, developed countries, a lot of the food waste, 30 to 50% of food is wasted. Needs to be movement there. And even someone like John Kerry, who is obviously Secretary of State for the USA, I saw a great talk by him last year, saying we really need to, the world should move to electric cars and decarbonising the use of energy. So I'm in a roundabout way coming around to this whole issue of environment and sustainability and this role that cultivated meat might play in sustainability. But I want us to remind us to think about how we define sustainability, because sustainability is often defined as greenhouse gas emissions and especially methane. And so greenhouse gas emissions, obviously, well, they are carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and also methane, and they're converted in their numbers to carbon dioxide equivalents. So maybe have a conversation around this whole sustainability and the water. And a component of the environment and sustainability is water use and water scarcity index. So in Australia, water is very scarce. So in fact, some crops such as soybeans, or if you take it to a cooked meal product or cooked rice, use a lot more water, for example, than some of the other products. And I think the other hard part about which is really exciting, that cell-based meat might increase our increase our sustainability, but we're trying to predict something that is so far is in the future and we don't have all the data yet. So I'm going to open it up now to maybe a conversation about this, and I might start with David.
Sure, yeah. There's a lot there. I think maybe I'll start with the definition of sustainability. I do think, Robin, as you suggested, that it's got to be, climate change has to be a part of it, but it's got to be more than that. You know, we think a lot about land and water use at Memphis Meats and just resource use in general. So what, and you know, why don't I think at a high level, we are expecting to provide significant benefits with cell-based meat for all three of those issues and other environmental issues. And the reason for that is we can apply all of our inputs towards just making the meat that people are looking for, as opposed to making, you know, powering a cow as they walk around or give birth, or, you know, heal a broken bone, things like that. We can input all of our caloric energy into just producing the meat that people are trying to eat. And as a result, we're expecting significant efficiencies in terms of the resource inputs to output. So for an example, to get 1 calorie of beef via a cow requires about 34 input calories in the form of grain and other sorts of animal feed. We are aiming to get that ratio down to 3 to 1. So that's a more than 10x reduction in the amount of input calories we would need to see 1 output calorie on the other side. And when I say output calorie, I'm of course referring to the meat that people would actually have access to and be eating. And every one of those input calories has an environmental footprint attached to it. And that includes a greenhouse gas emissions footprint. That includes the land it took to grow those crops, the water it took to feed those crops, and many other things as well. And so if we can reduce and increase the efficiency of meat production, we do expect that that will have very significant benefits for many environmental issues, including but not limited to climate change.
Thanks, David. And I'll hand over. Anyone else burning to speak, or I'll just pick a person otherwise? Yep.
I agree with you, Robin. I do think the jury's still out on how sustainable this new technology is. We know that it will be more sustainable than conventional agriculture, but by how much? And that's because none of these products are yet available at supermarket shelves. We haven't yet done life cycle assessments on, the very beginning of this production process all the way to when it hits consumers. So yeah, that's definitely still something that researchers are still trying to uncover. And, as David already mentioned, the inefficiencies in animal agriculture is really ridiculous. And the fact that we can use so much less land with this new technology, and all of this, the entire process can be powered with renewable energy, that alone is going to be way more sustainable than how we are currently producing meat.
Thanks, Bianca. And just on that, Carol Matic in the USA says, and I've read a few of the papers, when we decarbonise energy, she thinks that's when cultivated meat and some of this cellular agriculture will become, in terms of sustainability and greenhouse gas emissions, more viable. Next person, I think Thomas has turned his microphone off. Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah, just I guess building on what's already being said, and to offer a bit of an Australian context to your point, Robin, about Australian systems sometimes being different to systems like in the US, where we have more data, whereas in Australia there is sometimes gaps in data and more research and life cycle analyses needed. Firstly, I'll just acknowledge that there's no silver bullet solution to the challenges that we're facing in terms of the sustainability of our food system, and the fact that we're going to have a doubling in demand for protein and meat in the coming decades. And so there needs to be a drastic reduction in the environmental footprint of conventional protein systems, along with us adding new options and technologies into the mix to diversify protein supply. And of course, those options need to be less resource intensive and have fewer consequences. And here in Australia, we often hear the message that from the Australian livestock sector that its environmental credentials are far better than the rest of the world. And while it is true that we farm some animals differently here, the overall impact of the sector at a macro level is quite similar to other developed agricultural nations. So the federal government in Australia says that cattle and sheep alone account for 73% of total agricultural emissions, which makes livestock the greatest source of emissions in our country, following the burning of fossil fuels for fuel and energy. And that figure doesn't even include emissions from land clearing, which would make it considerably higher. Because according to national inventory figures, 72% of all deforestation in Australia is for livestock grazing. Professor James Watson from University of Queensland says, and I quote, "We clear more land in Australia than just about every country, or any country on the planet, especially for cattle farming." And so we know that the production of red meat, even in Australia, has a considerable environmental footprint. But it is true that at a per kilo basis, we do have lower CO2 emissions than the US. So a US system would be about 32 kilograms of CO2 for a kilo of beef, according to Weideman 2013, 15 and 16 research. Australian beef sits at about 20 to 26 kilograms of CO2 for a kilo of boneless beef based on northern or eastern Australian production systems. And so, of course, we know those figures are going to be lower again for things like chicken and pork. But when we start to look at other forms of meat such as that, we're then talking about more feedlotting systems and more grain-fed animals. And that requires considerable resources as well. And to David's point, the caloric conversion of feeding those calories to an animal to create the end product is expected to be far less efficient than feeding those nutrients directly to cells.
Thanks, Thomas, for those insights, especially on Australia. Liz, did you want to say anything? I was going to add something in myself. Just while, Liz, you're thinking, I think I follow one of the CSIRO scientists' publications, and it's very important that we take these foods to the kilograms of the product, or actually the product will be being eaten. So what's really interesting is, in fact, recent data out of the CSIRO group in the last couple of years showed, in fact, what's it called, the percent contribution of a food group to total greenhouse gas emissions in Australia from the Australian diet. Discretionary foods, which are the ones that we really shouldn't eat. So if we're eating healthy, we don't eat them, but they're the ones that are high in fat, high in sugar, the alcohol, the cookies, etc. They almost have equivalent greenhouse gas emissions to the meat and alternatives. So that's one interesting perspective I got out of some of their work. Liz, did you want to comment here at all? Since you've turned your microphone on.
Sure. I'll just say, I think I can just add one additional point to this important focus of the discussion. And that is that, part of what I see sort of on the more meta level of the representation of the birth of this industry is that it represents a paradigm shift, and it dovetails so beautifully with the emergence and growth and acceleration of the green energy sector. So that kind of dovetailing, it will be a win-win situation. When you're harnessing wind and solar and rain, water recapture, and all of these innovative, green energy technologies that are being that are so important, that will hopefully coincide with the birth of this industry. And I've certainly heard that talked about a lot when we were filming.
Thanks for that, Liz. I'm going to I always like to think of scenarios, what if? I always go, what if this or what if that? So I want to put something to the panel and just get your feedback on it. One is, I'm married to an environmental scientist, and so he says, we should actually be, people who are producing these things that are affecting the environment and greenhouse gas emissions maybe should be charged for it. That's one aspect. Should we be labelling for greenhouse gas emissions and water use? So some crops especially use a lot of water. But in amongst this, because we don't know the data yet, the papers I've read on the greenhouse gas emissions, especially the energy use and water use for cultivated meat, have shown that it may be equivalent to beef. It may be even higher than pork and chicken, for example. So in the scenario where cultivated meat maybe was equivalent in sustainability in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and maybe water and energy to beef or lamb or pork, do we still see a driver for the development of the cultivated meat industry? The other aspect to that is, should we be using labelling? So whoever turns their microphone on first.
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think A few things. One, I'm not familiar with papers that have suggested cell-based meat would be equivalent to beef in terms of environmental impact. And I think we have a lot of reasons to expect that it will provide significant environmental benefits. There have been a number of life cycle assessments. They're all projections for what production will look like once it's scaled up. And until we actually have a production facility, we'll need to actually look at that production facility to know exactly to what extent cell-based meat is providing these environmental benefits. And I do think there's reason to think that some of the projected LCAs could be operating off of assumptions from the biomedical space that might be relying on products that have not needed to achieve that same degree of efficiency because they have been higher cost, lower volume products. Setting that aside, I mean, I think it'll be up to individual country jurisdictions to decide whether or not, these environmental sustainability metrics belong on a label or somewhere else. What I do think is absolutely true is that one of the strongest trends in terms of the way consumers think of food is they want to know more. They want to know more about where their food is coming from, how it's made, what its environmental impact is, what its animal welfare impact is. And so I think there will be lots of ways to communicate that to consumer. Whether or not it belongs on a label versus a website versus any other place, I think will be something that regulators in each country will have to decide.
Thanks, David. Thomas now.
I'm happy to chime in. I think in addition to that, the piece around independent oversight and using the same methodology to assess the environmental impacts of different food types is really important. Sometimes we see creative or flattering accounting being used to try and calculate the environmental impacts of some conventional protein products and systems, which, I think is unfortunate. So if we can have a level playing field in how we compare and assess these options, I think that would be optimal. And to the point around, a scenario where, say, meat cultivated from cells is equivalent to something like chicken, one of the lower emitting protein types. I think there are so many driving factors behind this technology, and it extends beyond sustainability and environment when we're talking about the need for meat that isn't produced or isn't reliant on systems of industrial animal agriculture. And one of those factors is health. When we look at it from a public health lens, we know that there are significant potential benefits of this technology. We know that intensive animal agriculture is one key risk factor for things like antimicrobial resistance because of the amount of antibiotics and pharmaceuticals we're feeding to farmed animals, and also zoonosis, zoonotic disease, and pandemics. There are a whole range of complex risk factors that give rise to zoonosis, but the intensive production of animals for food is one of the key ones, according to the United Nations. And so there are a lot of motivators, and we know that we simply, the data's pretty crystal clear on the fact that we can't rely to the extent we have on systems of livestock production to meet that projected increase in demand for protein. So we should be looking at the potential and the credentials of new methods.
Thanks, Thomas. Liz, I just asked Liz, when you did the movie, it came through as sustainability being a big driver? And I agree with Thomas, by the way. I think that there's very good other drivers for developing cultivated meat, even if it's equivalent in sustainability to the other traditional meat production.
I think sustainability, a very fertile environment that we filmed in 2018 was the joint historic FDA-USDA public session where the public had the opportunity to put their comments, questions, concerns, and advocacy on the public record. And we had access to that room and all of that material to make sense of for this complex narrative, in the edit suite. So in that space, so many of the comments were focused around the theme of sustainability. And from every side of the aisle, because it was a very diverse room, there's so many different perspectives to be shared, so many questions around this. And, you know, almost everyone in that room was in agreement that sustainability is a very, very big, important topic, and that this, you know, that cell-based meat is absolutely, you know, focused on that.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Bianca, did you want to make a comment here?
I just wanted to comment on your comment about the labeling. I'm not sure how effective that will be for consumers, because, you know, we've got the current 5-star labeling for food on how healthy a product is, but, you know, it's not entirely accurate or even evidence-based. You've got really sugary cereals and junk food with, you know, sometimes 3-star ratings, because it's all based on the suggested serving size. But we all know when you get a big pack of chips, you're not going to eat, you know, like 25 grams of that. So in terms of creating a similar labeling system for sustainability, it is so complex, because it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions. It's about, you know, how much water we're using, all the things that Thomas has already mentioned, you know, land usage, antibiotic usage, incredibly complex. And yeah, I'm just not sure how effective that will be at driving change in consumer behaviour.
Yep, thanks, Bianca. So one of the interesting models that I've read about, it's interesting if you think about totally changing the face of animal agriculture. So some people might think we shouldn't be slaughtering any animals at all. And some people might think we need a mix. And then others have said, well, if you drove around the countryside and you saw no farm animals at all, so it really changes the rural landscape. And one of the models that I heard of, which, David, I wouldn't mind getting your comment on, whether it's feasible or not, I don't know, is one concept is, will cultivated meat remain this part of, you know, big corporate structure? And one of the papers I read said that maybe there could be like a distributed small system where the cells got distributed out to farmers, and they had these really small, like, bioreactor setups where they got something delivered to them, and then they grew it, you know, locally in their landscape, in their environment, obviously on much less land. And the review that I wrote, I think someone said it's no, not going to happen. So because it needs to be a component of these, you know, big companies, big corporations. David, could you, or anyone else, of course, comment on that and this concept of losing even rural? Someone mentioned society before in the social perspective, Liz, I think it was. But we must remember we have a very strong rural societies and rural networks, and they're a very important part of Australia and around the world, and actually rural economies all around the world, including underdeveloped countries who haven't got much money. David, could you maybe just give a comment on that?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is we don't actually expect cell-based meat to entirely displace animal agriculture. Yep. You know, one of the global trends we look at that many have referenced already in this conversation is just demand for meat is skyrocketing globally. It's expected to roughly double by 2050. And with that much of an increase in demand on the horizon, I think it's going to take multiple methods of meat production to meet that demand. And so I think there will be a place in the future meat market, not just for cell-based meat, but also for animal agriculture, for plant-based proteins, and you know, lots of different tools in the toolkit. That's number one. And number two, I think that there will be opportunities to provide you know, employment opportunities for folks who will be needed to operate the facilities that ultimately produce cell-based meat. You know, the first way that we at Memphis Meats are going to be bringing products to consumers, we are going to be producing that product ourselves, because we want to use that as an opportunity to collect feedback on the whole process, to understand, what the consumer is looking for, things like that. But once that is complete, then I think there are other business models and other opportunities that we would consider. And that could include, licensing the technology to others. So I think there's lots of possibilities, and we're really just scratching the surface right now. Step one is bring products to consumers. And then step two is figure out, what do we want the food system to look like? And of course, that's going to be a conversation, not just for Memphis Meats, but for all of the stakeholders involved in the food and ag space.
Thanks, David. I'll just get a comment from Bianca. Thanks.
Yeah, this idea of decentralizing cultivated meat production is actually quite popular in the field. There's an organization called Shojin Meat Project based in Japan, where they are trying to encourage citizen scientists to get involved. It's actually like really cheap to cultivate your own cells in your own kitchen. It's about like $70, I think, to buy all the equipment. So you really just need an incubator. So like a sous vide machine, which, can be quite cheap off the internet. You need some feeder for the cells, so you can use egg proteins, and you can just buy the starter cells from different companies. Trying to encourage people to start thinking about this in their own kitchen is something that a lot of people are talking about right now. And I think another important thing that we haven't yet really discussed is how are we consulting our Indigenous landowners and the current farmers. Thomas at Food Frontier is already doing a lot of work with trying to engage with the Australian agriculture industry. So yeah, that kind of work is really important.
Yeah, thanks, Bianca. And just to note, maybe of interest to people listening, we actually announced an initiative a number of weeks ago with the National Farmers Federation called the Future of Protein Forum. The National Farmers Federation, for anyone listening from overseas, is Australia's chief agricultural body and lobby group. And the idea behind that forum is to provide space for these sorts of conversations and to bring together traditional and conventional sectors in agriculture with new industries to help them understand what the emergence of these technologies means, the complementary nature of them, and to work collaboratively and collectively at that sort of national level, rather than this sort of infighting or fear-based approach, which I have to say, disappointingly, there are a handful of political and industry representatives that seem to bring about, thinking collectively in terms of our protein supply and how we're going to meet the challenges ahead of us is, in our view, far more constructive.
Thanks, Thomas. And I'm going to go to our final thoughts before we close the panel. So I'll hand to each of you. I'll start off. So really great session, really appreciate everyone's input. I'm the chair of a future food research project, there's a website for that, Future Food at Melbourne University. It's a hallmark research initiative, and there we have nutritionists, food engineers, food scientists, legal and labelling, the law school, and as well as the business school involved, and arts as well. So it's very multidisciplinary, and so we're really very fact-based, and we include in there some aspects of sustainability, and we do need more data, I think, on the sustainability, water use, greenhouse gas emissions, etc., for cellular agriculture, including cultivated meat. So, our drive is to provide the data. So I think there's been some really great insights from the movie and also some insights from the panel. So I thank the panel. I'm going to ask final thoughts. I'll start with Liz. Final thoughts before we close off the session.
Final thoughts from me? Okay, well, final thoughts would be, I think this has been a very robust and in-depth discussion that touches on the environment a lot, which I hope that our viewers, and especially associated with the Environmental Film Festival of Australia, will find illuminating. I think for people to learn more is really important. And, that is a driver for me as a filmmaker, is to make films that can be a contribution to the conversation and the and awareness and consciousness raising, and providing solution-focused storytelling is also really, really important to me and the people I work with. So I would just say shamelessly, please follow us and join the conversation. So on social media, our website, our newsletter, we're just getting the film out there. We're in our first several months of being on the film festival circuit, and doing a lot of panels, a lot of media and press coverage so far for the film. And the journey has really just started in terms of our outreach and engagement. So please be in touch if you'd like to get more involved, and please follow us. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. And next you can choose yourself, self-choose.
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, thank you to the Environmental Film Festival for making this happen. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you to Liz for documenting this historic journey of the emergence of this industry. I remember visiting the Memphis Meats original office space that's shown in the film back in, I think, 2016 or 17, and was at the GFI conference that was featured in the film in 2018. And I remember thinking in those moments, I hope someone's documenting this. I hope this story is told. And so I'm really, really pleased that it has been. So thank you, Liz. And for anyone that's interested in getting more involved locally, they can check out our website, foodfrontier.org. We produce research and reports, which are all free and available for download. And we're independent. We're funded entirely by donations. So if anyone's interested in supporting us, that's always very welcomed and appreciated. And we also have volunteers, so different students and professionals who will help with the development of our initiatives. So please get in touch if that's of interest.
Thanks, Thomas. Next is Bianca.
Yeah, I just want to say, this is such an interesting time for us to be in. We are on the brink of a new agricultural revolution, and Australia is really well placed to become a global leader in cellular agriculture. We have such strong world-leading expertise in stem cell research and regenerative medicine. All of that science can be applied into this new field of developing meat more sustainably. So we are basically trying to, make everyone aware of this new technology and basically promote the environmental and animal welfare benefits of cellular agriculture. So if you want to get involved, we are at www.cellularagricultureaustralia.org. And yeah, feel free to shoot me an email on the website.
Thanks, Bianca. And finally, David.
Yeah, well, like others, I want to thank the Environmental Film Festival of Australia. Australia is obviously such an important country in terms of meat production. And it's always just a real pleasure to speak with folks who care about, parts of or all of the mission of a company like Memphis Meats, whether that's the environmental sustainability piece, the animal welfare piece, the public health piece, or any of the other pieces. I do just want to say, we've talked so much about kind of the substance of cell-based meat on this panel, which is great because I think there's a lot of really interesting conversations to be had there. One thing I just want to note is that one of my favorite parts of the film, obviously there's lots, if you're interested in the substance, there's lots of that in the film as well. But one of the things that was coolest for me is how it provides a peek at the humans behind the company. And you can really understand, especially for Uma Valetti, our CEO, you can just understand, what motivates him, why he got into this. You get this really cool sneak peek into his childhood and the school he went to and all that. And so that was one of my favorite elements of the film. So I would just encourage everybody to watch it if you haven't already. And a huge thanks to Liz for making such a beautiful historical document, as you call it, and for everybody here for participating in this conversation. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, David. And I agree with you that it was really wonderful to see the journey that Memphis Meets went through, and especially see it through from Dr. Emma Valletti's eyes. And a couple of quick things from me. One is just watch the way the alternative protein landscape is changing, of which cell-based meat is one aspect. It's, if you look over the change in 1 to 2 years, it's just amazing. And also that Australian government should be supporting the development of a cultivated meat industry, because certainly India and the Netherlands had government support. It would really help to kick it off in Australia. And I also love working with all these wonderful young people who are here now, who have tremendous enthusiasm. I teach my students in meat and meat products about this topic, and they have an incredible amount of interest in it, and students who want to do masters and PhDs on the subject. So very exciting. I'd like to also thank the Environmental Film Festival. I'd like to thank Liz for an amazing movie to watch, and David for the Memphis Meats parts, and also I saw you in there. Thank Thomas at Food Frontiers and Bianca at Cellular Agriculture. I'd like to also thank Carolyn and Freya, who've been involved in coordinating. And finally, I'd really like to thank all of the people who've actually watched this panel that we've actually run, and it's running live at the moment. So thanks everyone who's been watching as well.
And thank you, Robin, for curating.
Thanks, Robin. You've done a great job.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Robin. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great to see everyone.